Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and these are the video lecture notes for History 17B, Chapter 27, Fighting the Good Fight in World War II, 1941 to 1945. Next slide. Here's a visual overview of the chapter. Next slide. The first heading of the chapter is entitled The Origins of War, Europe, Asia, and the United States. America sought at the end of the First World War to create new international relationships that would make such wars impossible in the future. Next slide. But as the Great Depression hit Europe, several new leaders arose to power under the new political ideologies of fascism and Nazism. Next slide. Still, the United States remained focused on the economic challenges of its own Great Depression. Next slide. Hence, there was little interest in getting involved in Europe's problems or even the China-Japan conflict. Next slide. Soon it became clear, however, that Germany and Italy's alliance was putting democratic countries at risk. Next slide. Roosevelt first sought to support Great Britain and China by providing economic support without intervening directly. And this cartoon talks about the Lend-Lease Act. Next slide. However, when Japan, an ally of Germany and Italy, attacked Pearl Harbor, catching the military base unaware and claiming thousands of lives, America's feelings toward war shifted, and the country was quickly pulled into the global conflict. Here's a famous photograph of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Next slide. The next heading is entitled The Home Front. The brunt of the war's damage occurred far from the United States, from United States soil, but Americans at home were still greatly affected by the war. Next slide. Women struggled to care for the children with scarce resources at their disposal, while sometimes while working full time. Next slide. Economically, the country surged forward, but strict rationing for the war effort meant that Americans still went without. Next slide. New employment opportunities opened up for women and ethnic minorities as white men enlisted or were drafted. Next slide. These new opportunities were positive for those who benefited from them, but they also created new anxieties among white men about racial and gender equality. Next slide. Race riots took place across the country, and Americans of Japanese ancestry were relocated to internment camps. Next slide. Still, there was an overwhelming sense of patriotism in the country, which was reflected in the culture of the day. Next slide. The next heading of the chapter is entitled Victory in the European Theater. Upon entering the war, President Roosevelt believed that the greatest threat to the long-term survival of democracy and freedom would be a German victory. Next slide. FDR entered into an alliance with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin to defeat the common enemy. Next slide. FDR's goal was to defeat the common enemy while also seeking to lay the foundation for a peaceful post-war world in which the United States would play a major and permanent role. In August of 1941, Churchill and Roosevelt signed a document laying out these principles in something called the Atlantic Charter. Next slide. Appeasement and non-intervention had proven to be short-sighted and tragic policies that failed to provide security and peace either for the United States or for the world. So the United States, this visual shows it trying to isolate itself, that proved to be impossible. Next slide. With the aid of the British, the United States invaded North Africa and from there invaded Europe by way of Italy. This would be 1942 and 1943 and 1944, kind of the early phase of the war in Europe. Next slide. However, the cross-channel invasion of Europe through France that Stalin and the Soviets had long called for did not come until 1944, by which time the Soviets had turned the tide of battle in Eastern Europe. This is a photograph of Allied forces landing on the beaches of France on D-Day. Next slide. The liberation of Hitler's concentration or death camps forced Allied nations to confront the grisly horrors that had been taking place as the war unfolded. Next slide. The big three, that would be Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, met one last time in February 1945 at Yalta, where Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to several conditions that strengthened Stalin's position. The Yalta Conference is one of the more controversial meetings probably ever held, and it helped set the stage for later Cold War events. Next slide. They planned to finalize their plans at a later conference, but Roosevelt died 2 months later. Next slide. The last heading of this chapter is entitled The Pacific Theater and the Atomic Bomb. The way in which the United States fought the war in the Pacific was fueled by fear of Japanese imperialistic aggression, as well as anger over Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and its mistreatment of its enemies. Next slide. It was also influenced by a long history of American racism towards Asians that dated back to the 19th century. Next slide. From hostile anti-Japanese propaganda to the use of 2 atomic bombs on Japanese cities, America's actions in the Pacific Campaign were far more aggressive than they were in the European theater. Next slide. Using the strategy of island hopping, the United States was able to get within striking distance of Japan, and this map here shows the path of America's progress across the Pacific Ocean, picking and choosing certain strategic islands on their way to getting within range of attacking Japan itself. Next slide. Only once they adopted this strategy were the Allied troops able to turn the tide against what had been a series of challenging Japanese victories. This is one of the most famous photographs ever taken. These are U.S. Marines putting up the American flag on the island of Iwo Jima, which was one of the last major battles in the Pacific of World War II. Next slide. The war ended with Japan's surrender after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Next slide. The combined Allied forces had successfully waged a crusade against Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. Next slide. The United States, forced to abandon a policy of non-intervention outside the Western Hemisphere, had been able to mobilize itself and produce the weapons and warriors necessary to defeat its enemies. Next slide. Following World War II, America would never again retreat from the global stage, and its early mastery of nuclear weapons would make it the dominant force in the post-war world. Next slide. And that's it for chapter 27.